Everyone loves tea. It is probably the second most enjoyed beverage in the world after water, and it's only getting more popular. But the tea trade today exists in a highly unequal global economy, where there are both winners and losers. In a time like our own, it is useful to look back on the original tea trade between southern China and inland Asia. Then, too, the wealth that the tea trade produced seldom made its way back to tea farmers. In the 1100s, when the Northern Song dynasty collapsed and the remnants of the regime retreated south, they still controlled all the major tea growing areas. This meant that if the subjects and rulers of northern dynasties, like the Jin or Liao, or western areas ruled by Tibet, wanted to drink tea, which they did, they were now going to have to pay, and pay the prices set by Song merchants and officials. For the 53 million strong population of the northern Jin dynasty, this was an expensive problem. Emperor Jin Zhangzong attempted to start a government-ran tea-growing initiative in parts of what are now Henan and Shandong province, well north of the tea-growing regions at the time. However, just 5 years into this project, the government gave up. Tea grown up there produced a flavor that was, quote, not good. Long after the Jin government abandoned this project, common people tried to make tea out of other herbal ingredients, like crabapple leaves, fringe tree leaves, or willow leaves, for centuries to come. But these plants could never deliver the same combination of caffeine, theanine, and other compounds that the Camellia sinensis plant had to offer. In the end, tea from the south still needed to be shipped and carried across vast distances. And this transportation would prove incredibly lucrative for everyone involved, except, of course, for the people who grew the tea, processed the tea, or actually carried the tea, not to mention the humble final consumer. For roughly a millennium, tea was among the most important objects of trade between southern China and the rest of inland Asia, meaning Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, and further afield. Tea was a central source of nutrition for some and an indispensable stimulant for all in centuries where these places had not yet learned about tobacco or coffee. Tea starts out as something very much on the margins of Chinese civilization. Early descriptions can basically be summarized as, quote, a bitter weed on the southwest frontier that mountain people put in soup with peppercorn. Also, it makes you stay awake, end quote. People really like this last part, and by the middle of the Tang dynasty, emperors, monks, farmers, and herdsmen alike were all drinking it. Between then and the end of the Qing dynasty, roughly 1,000 years, at least 7 major tea roads would develop. The oldest and most important of these roads would be the Qinshu Road and the Chuangkan Road. The former ran between northern Sichuan and what is now Gansu province, and the latter connected Chengdu to the Tibetan highlands. This former route ran more precisely from Guangyan up to Hanzhong, and then snaked around finally to Tianshui in southern Gansu, went through what is now some of the most remote, but still habitable country in China. It connected yellow and dark tea from northern Sichuan to the horse markets of the northwestern steppe. Qin horses from Gansu were of particular military value to the Song government, who needed to procure them at favorable rates in exchange for tea. Care was taken to stop any private tea sellers from Chengdu at the Jenga Pass back in Guangyan, and strict legal penalties were applied in order to prevent the flow of cheaper tea from, say, Hunan or Hubei. All of this was done to protect the government monopoly and officially set exchange rates back in Tianshui. More on that later. To the south, the Chuangkan Road between Ya'an and Kangding was significantly shorter, perhaps only 5 days by foot. However, this largely uphill journey to the Dadu River took one through wild mountains and hostile barbarians. At Kangding in the south and Tianshui in the north, there were officially sanctioned exchange points set up between Chinese tea merchants and various foreign agents, who would in turn carry the tea deeper into inland Asia. The Ming Dynasty would set up additional exchange points at places like Hezhou, Xining, Taozhou, Zhuanglang, and Baoning. Even later, after the consolidation of the Qing dynasty, this earlier system of tea horse trade outposts would be abandoned. They were already in control of Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia, as well as all of the horses those places produced, as well as all of the tea producing areas in southern China. They simply didn't need to regulate trade in the same way anymore. There was no lack of horses, there was no lack of tea. However, this would not be the end of the tea trade to inland Asia. 5 new paths would consolidate to better deliver tea up to thirsty shepherds and newer, smellier friends up north, now with beards. The old Kangchuan Road, inactive in the final turbulent years of the Ming Dynasty, would later be redeveloped as the Kangzang Road, bringing tea from the mountainous areas around Ya'an and Chengdu up to Kangding. It would be for this new, quote, southern road that Kangzhuan and Zhangcha, teas still enjoyed today, would be produced. Another route was the Songmao Road, which followed the Zugunao River up from what is now Duzhangyan to Li County. This road had already been in use for trade since at least the Tang Dynasty. But despite the relatively friendlier topography, raids on traders from local tribes in earlier periods made this immensely remote stretch of land the site of a much more limited volume of tea trade, maybe just 1/10 of the volume that the Kangzang Road saw to the south. It was only in the late Qing Dynasty did trade along this path really pick up. Perhaps the most famous route today laid further south, the Dianzang Road, connecting places in southern Yunnan like Xishuangbanna and Simao, up through Dali, Lijiang, and finally to the ethnically Tibetan areas across the Jinsha River in what is now called Shangri-La City. Although the volume of trade on this route was always small, the tea carried up from southern Yunnan would eventually develop into the tea we know today as pu'er. To the north, the Xibei, or Northwest Tea Road, and Mongolian tea roads would bring dark bricks from Hunan and Hubei, respectively, up to these final destinations. The Northwest Tea Road would go through Hanzhong or Xi'an before finally reaching Gansu, arriving in Tianshui or Longxi, where it could then be further transported up to Lanzhou, Xining, or Xinjiang, wherever the market took them. The Mongolian Tea Road went north from what is now Wuhan, up through Henan, Shanxi, Arlianhaute, and finally moving across the Gobi Desert up to Ulaanbaatar and more distant Russian markets. The Fuzhuan tea bricks, still made today both in Anhua and downstream, or rather upstream, in Shanxi's Jinyang area, are legacies of this trade. Meanwhile, the style of tea most associated with the Mongolian Tea Road, the Chuan brand Qing brick from the Red Cliff area, is still popular today in Mongolia and still produced in Red Cliff. Throughout pre-modern China, trade on these routes was taking place simultaneously with an internally facing tribute system that served officials, noblemen, and clergy, as well as a semi-regulated private market for common people. Not all tea produced in China was destined to be traded abroad. In fact, most of the tea produced in China was always for internal consumption. However, regardless if the destination was internal or external, these regulated systems would make and break the lives of millions. By the Song Dynasty, tea was already being grown widely throughout southern and central China. Farmers had already figured out things like not weeding when the tea saplings were still young, a lesson I learned much more recently. They also figured out the best organic fertilization regimens, with ash, legumes, and smellier things, practices which have continued to the present day, as well as annual pruning on tea bushes to maximize yield. While some farmers maintained just 1 or 2 tea bushes for household consumption, others planted entire gardens to support the blossoming demand for tea in urban centers throughout Asia. The Chinese feudal elite really liked to hang out and drink tea, and they had plenty of silver to buy the very finest stuff. However, the best tea was not for purchase. In fact, it was rather for the taking. Already, by 838, there was a tea emissary set up for Zhejiang's Huzhou, which is now the home of Anji Baicha, to make sure that the imperial state could speed up the, quote, collection of tribute tea from the area. And we know that at the peak of the setup, such an official saw the collection of up to 18,400 jin, which is like a pound kind of. All that tea was collected from the area and brought to government storehouses. Collection is probably too nice of a word because often the deal was give us tea or else. As a poem from the area centuries later would record, the tea grows fragrant and breaks my home. The fish of the river grow plump and I sell my children. The same tribute system that supplied the urban officials with a refreshing beverage perfect for group poetry and lazy afternoons, would also rob the very people who figured out how to grow the plant in the first place. In the northern Song dynasty, there was a law allowing these poor farmers to at least sell tea in local markets. But they were limited to just a few jin of tea per person per market, and only if a tax was paid. Some form of direct private marketing like this had always existed and would always exist alongside the more extractive taxes, but only at the mercurial mercy of officials and the large merchant households who they collaborated with. For much of the history of the inland tea trade, it would be Sichuanese farmers who would bear the burden. These were the people who were, for obvious geographic reasons, the most intimately involved. During the Ming Dynasty, they were not allowed to store more than 1 month's supply of tea in their own homes, and they would lose their tea fields if they were found to be in violation of this. If you tried to take the weeks or months long journey by foot out from your farm down to the urban areas and finally along these tea roads out to the nearest foreign tea markets and sell the tea yourself, you would lose not only your property but also your head. And sadly, there were many such cases. The history of Ming states that officials in Sichuan and southern Shanxi took 1/10 of all the tea produced by local farmers. If a tea garden was, quote, without an owner, 8/10 of all tea would be extracted by military work teams. Ideally, from the perspective of the Ming state, you would hand over 1/10 of the tea to these officials and then sell the other 9/10 to a large licensed merchant who could also be taxed. Nevertheless, geography and absolutely insane official exchange rates ensured that some farmers would continue to seek out, well, less guarded back roads. At the end of the Ming Dynasty, however, a civil war broke out between the remaining Ming loyalists, peasant rebels, and defectors to the ethnically Manchu Qing forces. This civil war would depopulate Sichuan and bring tea production there to a standstill. Those who were originally looking after the tea in the major growing areas clustered around Ya'an and Guangyuan either fled or died, leaving the new Qing officials with no tea to collect. The farmers that did survive struggled to find a local market for the low-quality material that was always intended for consumption elsewhere, far, far away. So, to solve this problem, a new generation of homesteaders were incentivized by tax relief and almost free real estate to repopulate the area. And a few generations of tea farmers saw their incomes actually rise, along with local merchants who helped pioneer the rebuilding of this tea trade. It seemed like a win-win. However, another round of domestic political chaos and merchant profiteering in the Republican era, after the fall of the Qing dynasty, would cause again most Sichuanese tea gardens to be abandoned. Many tea farmers became deeply in debt, and land there would become more heavily concentrated in the hands of landlords than in any other area of the country, with 2% of the province's population controlling 42% of all land. It is important to note that tea growers further east, producing tea for internal commoner markets or imperial tribute, were not necessarily any better off. Tea farmers in Luan and Huashan under the Ming and Qing dynasty tribute systems produced massive quantities of green and yellow tea, converting grain fields, bamboo groves, and mountain forests into tea gardens. And if you have ever seen an eerie old picture of China from the late 19th or early 20th century, you'll know that the fuel for all this tea production was the same fuel they used in every home and hearth, wood, meaning that all of this tea production could demand any forest in walking distance might be clear-cut. When heavy rain came, and it did come, there were disastrous landslides and famine. The soil loosened by all of the uprooting and clear-cutting. There was nothing to keep the soil attached to the mountainside. And when the landslides came, famine followed. When tribute tea contracts ceased and the private price of tea plummeted, the now dependent tea farmers and all the workers who had moved into the area now had to eke out a living as subsistence grain farmers in a hostile environment, or become transient laborers, or become soldiers. And soldier here could be interpreted in many ways. It is no wonder that the Dabia mountain range, which includes Luan and Huoshan, would produce more revolutionary commanders in the early 20th century than any other part of the country. The beloved TV drama action hero slash guerrilla commander Li Yunlong said, 楚兄啊，当年我在大别山的时候，赶上灾年，连饭都吃不上。那时候咱们领袖哪儿去了？ According to the plot, it was the brutal conditions of this place which forced him to become a revolutionary. And tea historian He Ling has argued that there is a long established pattern of cyclical boom and bust, with the end result always being the total ecological and social collapse of rural communities associated with particular famous teas, Guapian in Luan, or Diancha in Wuyishan, earlier back in the Ming Dynasty. If you found this video of interest, please come back and tune in for part 2 on tea merchants and porters. In solidarity. Bye.